Hello everyone, I'm delighted to be here today to give you some of my perspectives on specific populations in clinical trials. Here are the objectives of my talk. I'll be focusing on drug development considerations for children and pregnant and lactating individuals, and I'll mention some of the work we're doing currently in enhancing diversity in clinical trials. So FDA labeling regulation includes requirements for labeling of specific populations, and you can see here some of the specific populations that I'll be talking about today. There are other specific populations that I will not be discussing, including geriatric populations and patients with renal or hepatic impairment. So let me start this section with describing the historical problem for children. Prior to about the late 1990s, very few drugs that were used in children were actually approved for use in children, which of course led to significant off-label use. Why was this the case? Well, first of all, we understand clearly that there are differences between children with respect to development, drug metabolism, and toxicity, potential toxicity issues that require that we study drugs in children if we're going to use them in children. But often those studies were discouraged because of many issues, including ethical issues, fear of harming children, and of course perceived liability. There was also a lack of incentive for drug companies to conduct studies. And what this all led to was a situation in which practitioners were faced with a choice, either to not treat children with potentially beneficial medicines because they were not approved for use, or to treat patients based on limited data, anecdotal experience, or based on information from adult studies. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, there became a clear recognition that children should have access to products that have been appropriately evaluated, and that when drug developers are developing drugs for an adult use, if that drug would have a potential for use in children, that those product development programs should include pediatric studies. And of course, there's an important regulatory standard that must be met for conducting pediatric research. And these regulatory standards increase the strength and the quality of the research. These concepts were all outlined in a very important document, the ICH, that's the International Conference on Harmonization, E11 and E11R1, Clinical Investigations of Medicinal Products in the Pediatric Population. Around the same time that the ICH E11 was originally published in 2000, there was a movement in the United States to ensure that children had access to approved drugs as well. And so there were advocates, children advocates across the country who lobbied Congress to pass pediatric drug development laws. And what we had passed in 2002 was the Best Pharmaceuticals for Children Act, or BPCA, and then shortly following in 2003, the Pediatric Research Equity Act, or PREA. PREA, as you can see on the left-hand side, requires studies. So FDA is given the authority to require studies under certain circumstances for diseases or conditions that occur both in adult and pediatric populations. Now, importantly, products with orphan designation are exempt from requirements under PREA, with the exception of certain pediatric cancer drugs. And information from those studies that are required by FDA must be labeled. On the other side, BPCA is a voluntary or incentive provision, which allows for 6 months of additional marketing exclusivity if studies are completed and submitted to FDA that are in response to FDA's request for certain studies. Now, it's also important that orphan designated products can be included under BPCA, and information from those studies must also be included in labeling. Now, you can see that there's an intersection between PREA and BPCA, and we believe that these two laws work together hand in hand to increase the availability of approved drugs and biological products for the treatment of children. So on the next few slides, I want to provide some comments on therapeutics development in children. And importantly, in the U.S., there's an evidentiary standard for approval, and that approval is no different for children compared to adults. And that is, as you've probably heard from previous talks, that in order for a drug to be approved in the U.S., there must be demonstration of substantial evidence of effectiveness and clinical benefit. That is, how a treatment impacts a patient's ability to feel, function, or survive, or that it improves or delay in the progression of clinically meaningful aspects of a disease. And that evidence is usually required through the conduct of adequate and well-controlled investigations. And there must also be important safety information included to apply an appropriate risk-benefit analysis. So while the approval standards are the same for children and adults for drugs in the U.S., there are special considerations that relate to children. First, and very importantly, are the ethical considerations. And I could give a talk for an hour just on the ethical considerations. But the 3 points highlighted here are very important and include that children should only be enrolled in clinical trials if the objectives and the scientific data necessary cannot be met by enrolling a population that can provide informed consent. Also, a child cannot be enrolled in a clinical trial unless there's a prospect of direct benefit. And that's important for any trial that would expose a child to a risk that would be considered any more than a minor increase over minimal risk. And then also, children should not be obviously placed in a disadvantage for enrolling in a clinical trial. There's also important feasibility considerations with respect to pediatric product development. And this is, I guess, a good thing for children, and that is that generally children are healthier and that the prevalence or incidence of disease in many pediatric populations is lower than that seen in that same disease in adults. Nevertheless, these feasibility considerations can play an important role in successful completion and the design of pediatric clinical trials. So I've described the ethical and feasibility differences in therapeutics development between children and adults. There are additional special considerations that I want to go over on this slide. Firstly, formulation development may be different, and that may seem obvious to many of you, but children below a certain age may not be able to take and swallow safely in a solid oral dosage form, so there may be a need for different types of formulations that are acceptable to children. Additionally, even if you have an appropriate oral dosage form, you may need to consider different strengths or different concentrations to allow for accurate dosing of all pediatric age groups. Animal toxicology studies, there may be a need when there are specific developmental safety concerns to conduct specific juvenile toxicology studies, and I provided a very important guidance, and another ICH guidance, S11, that you can refer to when considering the need for juvenile toxicology studies. There are clearly study design considerations ranging from dose selection to the choice of endpoint or control, as well as the monitoring of safety, including developmental safety issues that should be considered. And then the timing of the studies. When should the pediatric studies be initiated relative to the initiation or the completion of adult drug development? And then finally, and I'll talk later on about the use of pediatric extrapolation, a very important framework to consider, and I'll speak about that in a few minutes. Many of these, or all of these considerations are discussed, as I mentioned, in that ICH E11 guideline, and then the revision to the guideline, and I've created the link here for you. So now I want to discuss pediatric extrapolation. As I mentioned briefly on the previous slide, this is a very important concept that can be applied specifically in pediatric therapeutics development programs. This new guideline that was published in August of this year, the ICH E11A Pediatric Guideline, goes into very important details on how to apply pediatric extrapolation. But let me just spend a little bit of time to explain how that can be applied in a pediatric development program. First of all, pediatric extrapolation is defined here in the first bullet. But what I really want to explain to you is that in an adult development program, in a successful one, when you've established efficacy and safety, in the subsequent pediatric development program for that same condition, if it is determined that there is sufficient similarity between the disease, the drug pharmacology, and the response to treatment between the adult reference population and the target pediatric population, then you may be able to develop or design a program that can leverage the data already collected on safety and efficacy in the adult program and apply that to the pediatric program. Clearly, if data can be leveraged in an adult program that would support a pediatric program, this could lead to an increase in the efficiency and success of pediatric drug development and greatly decrease the time necessary. However, in order to apply pediatric extrapolation, as described in the guidance, there needs to be robust information to support the similarities between the adult and pediatric populations. And importantly, any differences that may affect the degree to which pediatric extrapolation approaches can be applied. The guidance also describes that efficacy and safety can be extrapolated given the appropriate support and justification. And another important point about developing a pediatric extrapolation approach is the need to have multidisciplinary expertise, including specialists in pediatrics and in the specific disease, clinical pharmacology experts, as well as biostatistical expertise. There are many examples of pediatric extrapolation that I could go into, which I won't, because I think it's better to refer you to this guidance and to read it carefully, because there are great examples within the guidance, as well as training material examples at the ICH website that I can direct you to for more information. So now that I've given you a taste or flavor of the important components of a pediatric drug development plan, here's where I want to talk to you about some regulatory requirements. So under PREA, as I mentioned, the Pediatric Research Equity Act, there's a requirement for sponsors to submit their plans for how they're going to study children that they may be required to study under PREA in the submission to FDA of an initial pediatric study plan, or IPSP. This guidance was finalized in 2020. And in this guidance, it goes through important considerations for what to submit, how to submit, and when to submit these IPSPs to FDA. And this IPSP is really intended to provide FDA with a chance to review plans for pediatric therapeutics development and to provide advice and recommendations about those plans. Importantly, you can get a lot of information from the guidance, and I've provided the link here. But we want these plans submitted as early as possible during drug development, but certainly no later than the end of phase 2 in most situations. So what have been the effects of BPCA and PREA over the last almost 25 years now? And as you can see here, again, prior to the late 1990s, almost no drugs had pediatric-specific labeling. And you can see here that there's been really a clear linear increase in the number of labeling changes with pediatric-specific information over the last 20 years. And I'm happy to report that we have over 1,100 labelings with pediatric-specific information over the last 20 years. So I believe that this is evidence of the effect, the very important positive effect that the laws in the U.S. have led to drugs that are now appropriately labeled for use in children. Now I'd like to turn my attention to inclusion of pregnant individuals in clinical trials. Some important background information. There are approximately 5.5 million pregnancies in the United States each year, and clearly pregnant women may have chronic conditions that exist before they're pregnant, or they develop conditions while they're pregnant, and they can also have conditions specifically related to their pregnancy. Just like children, though, pregnant individuals have historically been excluded from drug development trials, and oftentimes at the time of approval, the only safety information we have come from non-clinical, usually animal reproductive toxicology safety studies. So here on this slide, I want to make some remarks about similarities and differences between adults and children, specifically pregnant and lactating adults. So children, pregnant and lactating adults should have access to medicines that have been appropriately evaluated. But when a drug is approved in adults, it's also approved in pregnant and lactating adults, which is unlike the situation in children, where approval in adults does not automatically mean that safety and effectiveness have been established in children. However, in pregnancy and lactation, there are important physiological changes that can impact the safety and dosing of drugs. And oftentimes at the time of approval, the only information we have are from animals. Therefore, there's an important need to consider collection of safety and dosing information in addition to what has already been collected in non-clinical studies. And this is all to support prescribers and patients being able to make informed decisions about whether to take a drug during pregnancy or lactation. As I mentioned, just like children, there has been this general approach to automatically exclude pregnant or lactating individuals from clinical trials. But there's been an increasing awareness over the last few years that there needs to be a paradigm shift, and that there are interested stakeholders and advocates that recognize that pregnant and lactating individuals can be safely included in clinical trials under certain circumstances. There are also regulatory advances that are occurring to change this automatic exclusion paradigm, including that the common rule, which is regulation that is promulgated by NIH to remove the reference of pregnant individuals as vulnerable, and FDA is working to harmonize this regulation with the NIH regulation. So what are some issues that must be considered before including pregnant individuals in clinical trials? I want to point out that FDA published a guidance on this topic. It's a draft guidance in 2017, and this information is all contained in the guidance. But let me go over some important highlights. The first is, before pregnant individuals can be studied, there must be at least some margin of safety established through the conduct of non-clinical studies in pregnant animals. And that's no different than going into adult populations or pediatric populations, that we must have the safety identified or evaluated, generally first in non-clinical studies. In the pre-marketing setting, it's important, again, because there is the need to understand the benefit to the pregnant woman and fetus before enrolling a pregnant individual in a clinical trial pre-marketing, that there must be a prospect of direct benefit, and that information that you obtain by enrolling that pregnant individual cannot be obtained by other means. In the post-marketing setting, generally we'd like to have some safety data available in non-pregnant individuals, adults, and that there may be some information to support it from the literature. Now, in addition to that two conditions exist. One, that efficacy can't be extrapolated, and two, that you can't get the safety information from any other means. And these are important principles that need to be present before enrolling pregnant individuals, either in the pre-market or post-market setting. The other thing that's important that's discussed in the guidance is what happens when a patient becomes pregnant during the clinical trial. And there are important considerations there, and to not lose the opportunity to collect some information because that patient became pregnant during the trial. Now, that patient should be immediately unblinded so we know whether or not the patient was exposed to drug or whether not through or just placebo, and that the patient should undergo a reconsenting process, because that patient may actually want to continue in the study because the exposure has already occurred, and there's the ability to collect important additional safety as well as PK and dosing information. So in addition to the guideline that FDA published in 2017 about inclusion of pregnant individuals in clinical trials, a report was recently published by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And this report was specifically to evaluate liability associated with enrollment of pregnant individuals in clinical trials. And the report's key findings are listed here, and somewhat surprising. And again, I would be happy to discuss this offline with those of you who might be interested. But one important finding is that there's a lack of evidence of liability actually related to enrollment of pregnant and lactating individuals in clinical trials. But there is potential liability after approval if pregnant individuals are exposed to those drugs, liability to the prescribers and potentially to drug manufacturers. And the report also concludes that liability could actually be prevented by including pregnant individuals in clinical trials. And I've given you the link to the report. It's quite a detailed report. And again, there are some limitations in these findings, but I think the report really highlights some perceptions that maybe need to be changed about inclusion of pregnant individuals in clinical trials. I also want to highlight ongoing work at the ICH level, that there is a guideline under development right now on inclusion of pregnant and breastfeeding individuals in clinical trials. And you can see here what the goals of that harmonized global guideline will include. So in the last few minutes, I want to discuss what FDA is doing to enhance diversity in clinical trials. So on this slide is a quote from our current FDA Commissioner, Dr. Rob Califf. And basically, Dr. Califf has made ensuring diversity in clinical trials an important issue for FDA to tackle because it is a fundamental public health issue. Now, in addition to his quote, FDA has been working to ensure the health of the whole public, including underrepresented populations, and that clinical trials should reflect the population that is most likely to use the drug. And that includes populations who have generally been underrepresented in clinical trials. So I don't have time in detail to go over all of FDA's efforts to ensure diversity in clinical trials, but suffice to say, you can see that FDA has been very busy over the last few years with guidances and workshops to help sponsors understand and incorporate diversity in clinical trials. I will also want to especially point out at the bottom the ADEPT-9, or the Advancing Development of Pediatric Therapeutics. Our 9th conference was specifically convened to discuss enhancing diversity in pediatric clinical trials. And this was just convened a couple of months ago. There was very robust discussion, and patient advocates as well as patients themselves discussing the importance of diversity in clinical trials. Just a quick word about how decentralized trials may enhance the ability to enroll a diverse population. So decentralized clinical trial is just a trial where not all of the information is collected at the investigator's location, but some or all of the trial activities could be conducted at a remote location from the clinical trial sites. There are clear potential benefits, including patients not having to travel to those centers, take time off of work, find childcare, etc. That it can increase enrollment, particularly for rare sporadic diseases where patients may need to travel hundreds of miles to get to a site. And even when they are enrolled, it can improve continued participation and maintaining patients in clinical trials and avoiding dropouts, because some or all of those endpoints and measurements can be collected closer to the patient. Obviously, there are challenges related to that, including the need for training, as well as tracking strategies, because you're likely going to need more personnel in a decentralized trial. And then, of course, compliance issues that need to be worked out to ensure that the data collected are valid and reliable. So in summary, I hope to have conveyed to you that children, pregnant, and lactating individuals deserve to have access to medicines that have been developed with sufficient information to support their safe and effective use in these specific populations. That drug development should be designed early to include these specific populations and plans to collect data in these specific populations when it's expected that if the drug is approved, it will be used in these specific populations. Of course, that requires early planning. And just some, what I would say, catchphrases that I'd like to start hearing, and I'm bringing and presenting to you right now. That the health of the child begins with the health of the mother. And that children, pregnant, and lactating individuals are protected through research, not from research. And finally, that the U.S. population has become increasingly diverse, and clinical trials should reflect the population most likely to use the drug. And so there's a need to enhance the diversity of the clinical trials we are conducting for the specific benefit of all patients who could benefit from the use of an approved drug. Thank you very much for your attention. And before I forget, I have a challenge question for you. Specific populations that should be considered for enrollment in clinical trials during drug development include A, pediatric populations, B, pregnant and lactating populations, D, all of the above, E, none of the above. And I'll give you a minute to answer. And the answer, of course, is D, all of the above. Thank you again for giving me this opportunity to present to you today.